On September 14, 1847, inside a plantation house 12 miles south of Charleston, South Carolina, something occurred that local authorities would spend the next 60 years trying to erase. 7 members of the Grantham family were found dead in their beds. Their throats were cut with surgical precision. Clean, deliberate, unmistakably practiced. There were no signs of struggle, no shattered furniture, no screams reported by neighboring estates, only silence. The sole person missing from the plantation was a young enslaved man named Samuel, purchased 3 years earlier for the astonishing sum of $800. Not for strength, not for skill, but because his skin was white as porcelain and his eyes carried an unnatural hue, pale, almost rose-colored, something the Granthams referred to as a living curiosity. The Charleston Courier printed exactly one article about the murders. Then its owner received a private visit from 3 prominent planters. No further coverage appeared. No trial was ever held. No body was ever recovered. In the weeks following that September night, 4 additional plantation families reported strange incidents. Traveling papers stolen, documents forged, money missing. Always taken while households slept. Always without a sound. The official explanation claimed Samuel had drowned while attempting to cross the Ashley River. But within the enslaved community, another story endured, passed in whispers from generation to generation. A story not of rage, but of planning. Not of chaos, but of patience. Something far more terrifying than a single violent night. Before we continue with the story of Grantham Plantation and the man they reduced to a curiosity, we need you to be part of this journey. If you're listening from South Carolina, Georgia, anywhere in the American South, or from anywhere in the world, leave a comment and tell us which country you're watching from. And if you believe stories like Samuel's deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Vintage Chains and turn on the notification bell. We uncover the histories others tried to bury, and there are many more waiting in the shadows. Now, let's step back. 3 years before that September night, they had 3 children. Margaret, 16, already promised to the son of a tobacco magnate. Thomas Jr., 13, being groomed to inherit, and little Catherine, only 8, who still believed her father hung the stars. Constance ran the household with the efficiency expected of a plant's wife, managing the domestic staff, overseeing the kitchen, and ensuring the family maintained their position in Charleston society. The plantation house itself sat on a slight rise, as much elevation as the flat, low country offered, its white columns visible from the river road. Inside, everything spoke of wealth carefully displayed, imported furniture from England, crystal from France, portraits of Grantham ancestors who'd fought in the Revolution. The library held over 300 volumes, many of them concerning natural philosophy, anatomy, and what Thaddeus called the science of racial characteristics. It was this last interest that brought Thaddeus to the Charleston slave market on a humid May morning in 1844, accompanied by his factor, Edmund Ruddled, a thin man with calculating eyes who handled the business of buying and selling human property with the same attention he gave to cotton futures. The market near Chalmers Street was already crowded, the auction blocks surrounded by planters evaluating the day's offerings. Thaddeus had no particular need for additional field hands. "For yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are ye that hunger now, for ye shall be filled. Blessed are ye that weep now, for ye shall laugh." Thaddeus felt a smile spread across his face. Here was something truly rare. Not just the physical peculiarity, but an educated anomaly, a living specimen that could be observed, studied, catalogued. His mind was already racing with possibilities. He could document the condition, write papers for the journals in Philadelphia, perhaps even present findings to the Charleston Medical Society. $800, Harwick said, naming a price that made Ruddled cough. "I know it's steep, but you won't find another like him." $700, Thaddeus counted automatically, though his mind was already made up. They settled on $750. Papers were signed, money exchanged. Samuel was led to the wagon without a word, his pink eyes fixed on something in the distance that no one else could see. On the ride back to the plantation, Rutledge broke the silence. "What exactly do you plan to do with him? That's nearly twice what you'd pay for a prime field hand." Thaddeus watched the road ahead, already imagining the locked journal where he'd record his observations, the letters he'd write to colleagues in Boston and Baltimore. "Study him, Edmund. Document the condition. Think of the scientific value. We're living in an age of discovery, of understanding the natural world in ways our fathers never could. This young man is a living, breathing example of nature's variations. What Thaddeus didn't say, what he perhaps didn't even recognize in himself yet, was that he'd purchased more than a subject for study. He'd acquired something he believed made him special, a collector's pride in possessing what no one else had. In the back of the wagon, hands bound with rope that wasn't strictly necessary, but was traditional for a new purchase, Samuel stared at the passing landscape with those telling pink eyes and said nothing at all. The other enslaved people on Grandanthem Plantation first saw Samuel when he arrived that evening, and the response was immediate and visceral. Some made signs against evil, others simply stared. The overseer, a brutal man named Virgil Cates, who enforced discipline with a whip he called Persuader, seemed uncertain how to classify this new arrival. But Thaddeus had plans that didn't involve the fields. He'd already decided that Samuel would live in a small room in the main house in the servants' quarters, near the kitchen. This proximity would allow for daily observations, measurements, tests of sensitivity to light, documentation of any peculiarities in behavior or physiology. That first night, as Constance prepared for bed, she confronted her husband about the purchase. "You brought him into the house, Thaddeus. What will people say?" "They'll say we're at the forefront of natural philosophy," Thaddeus replied, already writing in his new observation journal by candlelight. "Samuel represents a rare opportunity to study a condition that few have documented. His presence here serves science. His presence here serves your vanity," Constance said quietly, but she knew better than to push further. Her husband's enthusiasms, once ignited, burned until they exhausted themselves. This too would pass, she told herself. She just had to be patient. But in the small room off the kitchen, Samuel lay awake on the narrow bed, his pale hands folded across his chest, his pink eyes reflecting the moonlight through the single window. In the 3 years since his previous owner's death had sent him to the auction block, he'd been sold 4 times. Each owner had been drawn by his unusual appearance. Each had treated him as an object of curiosity rather than a human being. Samuel had learned many things in those 3 years. He'd learned that educated slaves made white people nervous. He'd learned that his appearance could unsettle even cruel men. He'd learned that freedom, papers, could be forged if you were patient enough to practice the handwriting. He'd learned that people who viewed you as a curiosity never really looked at you carefully. They saw the unusual coloring but missed the intelligence calculating behind those strange eyes. And most importantly, Samuel had learned to wait. The first 6 months of Samuel's life at Grantham Plantation followed a strange pattern that existed in a space between slavery and something else entirely. Not freedom, never that, but a peculiar kind of captivity that felt almost like theater. Thaddeus had him photographed using the new daguerreotype process, the image capturing Samuel's ghostly power in unsettling detail. He measured Samuel's skull with calipers, recorded the dimensions in careful columns, and compared the numbers to measurements from his other slaves, seeking patterns that existed only in his imagination. Twice a week, Thaddeus subjected Samuel to light tolerance tests, making him stand in direct sunlight for increasing intervals while recording the time until his skin began to reen and burn. Samuel endured these sessions without complaint, his face carefully blank while inside him something cold and patient grew stronger. The Grantham children reacted to Samuel's presence in different ways. Margaret, at 16, felt a confused mixture of fascination and repulsion. She'd been raised to view enslaved people as inferior beings, yet Samuel's education and careful speech challenged her assumptions. She took to observing him from doorways, trying to reconcile her father's scientific enthusiasm with her own unsettled feelings. Thomas Jr. adopted his father's attitude of clinical interest, asking questions about albinism and whether it could occur in other animals. At 13, he was already practicing the casual cruelty of the planter class, sometimes ordering Samuel to perform small tasks simply to assert his own authority. Only little Catherine treated Samuel as human. She was too young to fully understand the implications of ownership, and his unusual appearance fascinated her without frightening her. She began bringing him books from her father's library, asking him to read to her, a request that Constance would have forbidden if she'd known about it. It was through Catherine that Samuel first understood the true layout of the house. As she led him to the library for their secret reading sessions, he memorized the floor plan, the servants' stair that connected all 3 floors, the back entrance through the kitchen, the door to Thaddeus's study where the plantation records were kept, and most importantly, the master bedroom, where Thaddeus and Constance slept by October of 1844. Samuel had become a fixture in the household routine. He served at dinner parties where Thaddeus would inevitably bring up his fascinating specimen and subject guests to detailed explanations of albinism. He stood silent during these displays, serving wine and clearing plates while planters and their wives studied him with the same attention they'd give to a painting or an unusual flower arrangement. During one such dinner, a physician from Charleston named Dr. Whitfield engaged Thaddeus in an animated discussion about whether albinism represented a distinct racial category or simply a medical oddity. They debated this over roasted duck and rice, speaking about Samuel as if he weren't standing 3 feet away. The question, Dr. Whitfield said, gesturing with his wine glass, is whether the condition affects mental faculties. You've tested his intelligence, surely. Extensively, Thaddeus replied. He's literate, articulate, capable of complex reasoning. In many ways, he's more intelligent than my field hands. Fascinating. Yet his value is diminished by the sun's sensitivity, nature's trade-off, perhaps enhanced mental capacity at the cost of physical utility. The doctor turned to Samuel directly for the first time. Tell me, boy, do you have dreams? Samuel's pink eyes fixed on the doctor with an intensity that made the older man shift uncomfortably. Yes, sir, I dream of freedom. The table fell silent. Then Thaddeus laughed, a forced sound that the other guests awkwardly joined. Well, don't we all dream of freedom from something? But we're bound by duty, by obligation, by the natural order. Isn't that right, Samuel? Yes, sir, Samuel replied, refilling the doctor's wine glass with a steady hand. But something in his tone made Dr. Whitfield lose his appetite for the rest of the meal. The winter of 1844 brought changes to the household routine. Thaddeus began spending more time in Charleston, attending meetings of the Medical Society, where he presented his observations on albinism to tepid interest. The scientific community was less impressed with his documentation than he'd hoped, and this rejection festered into obsession. He doubled his efforts, subjecting Samuel to increasingly uncomfortable examinations, measuring blood pressure, testing reflexes, attempting to determine if the condition affected internal organs. Samuel endured it all with the same careful passivity, but those who paid attention, and only a few did, might have noticed subtle changes. He'd begun requesting books on navigation and geography, claiming they helped him serve the family better by understanding maps when they discussed travel. Catherine, delighted to have a reading companion, brought him atlas after atlas without understanding their true purpose. He'd also cultivated a relationship with Ezra, an elderly enslaved man who worked in the stable and had been on the plantation longer than anyone could remember. Ezra had seen 3 generations of Granthams, had witnessed the slow corruption of each by the absolute power they held over other human beings. He recognized in Samuel something he'd only seen a few times in his long life. A person who had made a decision, who was waiting for the right moment to act. You planning something? Ezra said one evening as they sat in the stable, ostensibly checking on a horse with a slight limp. It wasn't a question. Samuel said nothing for a long moment. Then if a man owns you like property, treats you like an object, displays you like a trophy, what do you owe him? Nothing, Ezra replied. But vengeance got a price too. You ready to pay it? I've been paying it for 22 years. Samuel's pale hands stroked the horse's neck, his touch gentle despite the anger in his voice. Every day I've been looked at instead of seen. Every moment I've been studied instead of known. The price is already paid. Now I'm just collecting what's owed. Ezra was quiet, then nodded slowly. Then you be careful and you be thorough, because if you do what I think you planning, there can't be no half measures. Can't leave witnesses to tell a different story than the one you need told. By spring of 1845, Samuel had been at Grantham Plantation for a year. The household had grown accustomed to his presence, which was exactly what he'd been counting on. Familiarity bred carelessness. The family no longer watched him carefully. Thaddeus's initial scientific enthusiasm had waned. He'd exhausted the observable aspects of Samuel's condition, and the medical journals had shown little interest in publishing his findings. Samuel had become simply another servant, unusual to look at, but ultimately just part of the household furniture. This was when Samuel began his real preparations. He'd identified the unlocked window in Thaddeus's study, the one the planter opened on warm evenings for air circulation. He'd noted which floorboards creaked on the path from the servants' quarters to the family bedrooms. He'd learned the household sleep patterns. Thaddeus often read late into the night while Constance took laudanum for her nerves and slept deeply. The children slept on the third floor, their rooms arranged along a hallway that could be accessed by both the main staircase and the servants' stair, and he'd begun stealing small amounts at first. A few dollars from the household accounts, a page from the plantation ledger showing his purchase price, a blank sheet of paper with Thaddeus's letterhead. These items he hid in a loose board beneath his bed, along with a traveling knife he'd taken from the kitchen, its blade honed to razor sharpness on the grinding stone in the stable. But Samuel's most important theft came in July of 1845, when he managed to access Thaddeus's study while the family attended Sunday service. He'd begged off with a convincing display of stomach illness, and during the 2 hours the house stood empty, except for old Ruth in the kitchen, who was nearly deaf. Samuel copied Thaddeus's handwriting over and over until he could reproduce it perfectly. Then he drafted 3 different versions of freedom papers, each one more elaborate than the last, until he had a document that would pass any but the most detailed inspection. The paper declared that Samuel, having served faithfully and demonstrated unusual intelligence and character, was hereby manumitted and granted his freedom with the right to travel unmolested throughout the United States. The date he left blank, he'd fill it in when the time came. Throughout the summer and fall of 1845, Samuel maintained his careful performance of civility while preparing for something the Grand Anthem family couldn't imagine. He memorized the ROS to Charleston, the schedule of the steamships that departed for northern ports, the names of free black communities in Philadelphia and Boston, where a man with unusual appearance might disappear into anonymity. He also made 2 more quiet alliances among the enslaved community. Dinah, who worked in the main house, had a daughter who'd been sold south the previous year. She understood rage. Jacob, a field hand who'd been whipped within an inch of his life for learning to read, understood revenge. Neither of them knew Samuel's exact plans, but they agreed to 2 things. They would ensure alibis on whatever night Samuel chose to act, and they would report seeing him flee toward the river, providing a false trail for any pursuit. December of 1845 brought early cold to the low country. Ice formed on the edges of the ponds, and Spanish moss hung stiff and frosted from the oak trees. The Grantham family prepared for Christmas with their usual elaborate parties and gift-giving, while Samuel watched and waited and refined his plans until they were as sharp as the blade he kept hidden beneath the loose board. On Christmas Eve, Thaddeus hosted 30 guests for dinner. Samuel served throughout the evening, invisible in his visibility, carrying trays and pouring wine while the planter class celebrated another year of prosperity built on the backs of human property. Late in the evening, after most guests had departed, Thaddeus called Samuel to the library. "I'm writing a paper on hereditary conditions," the planter said, not looking up from his desk. "I need you to provide a detailed account of your family history. Parents, grandparents, any siblings. I want to document whether albinism runs in bloodlines." Samuel stood silent for a moment, then spoke quietly. "My mother was sold away when I was 6. My father I never knew. I had a sister once, but the trader who bought her said she wool. Didn't last the journey south. That's my family history, sir. That's all the document you're ever going to get." Something in his tone made Thaddeus look up sharply, but Samuel's face remained carefully neutral, those pink eyes reflecting nothing but candlelight. The planter frowned, then waved dismissively. "That will be all. You may go." Samuel left the library, his heart beating steadily, his mind clear. He'd just decided something. It would be soon. Very soon, because he'd realized that Thaddeus would never see him as human, would never stop trying to categorize and measure and document him as if he were a butterfly pinned to a board. And if you're already considered dead by the people who own you, what's the harm in proving them right? The winter of 1846 arrived with unusual ferocity, bringing storms that rattled the windows of the plantation house and turned the roads to mud. Samuel used the harsh weather as cover for his final preparations, knowing that bad conditions would make pursuit more difficult. He calculated that he needed 4 hours, 2 to execute his plan, 2 to reach a hiding spot he'd prepared in the swamp where Ezra had shown him an abandoned cabin used by runaway slaves before they attempted the dangerous journey north. But something unexpected happened in February that almost derailed everything. Margaret, now 17, had been reading her father's journals and became fascinated by Samuel's case. She began seeking him out, asking questions about his experiences, his thoughts on his condition. Her interest seemed genuine, untainted by her father's scientific coldness, and for a brief moment Samuel felt something dangerous. Hope that perhaps one person in this cursed household saw him as human. That hope died on a rainy evening in March when he overheard Margaret and her mother discussing him in the parlor. "He's actually quite intelligent, Mother," Margaret said. "Perhaps more so than many white people I know. Doesn't that challenge what we've been taught about racial hierarchy?" Constance's response was sharp and immediate. "Don't let your father's scientific hobby confuse you, child. Intelligence in a slave is like a singing bird. A curiosity that amuses us, but it doesn't change what they are. Samuel is property purchased and paid for. Never forget that. No matter how articulate he might be, Samuel stood frozen in the hallway, a tea service growing cold in his hands. In that moment, whatever restraint had been holding him back dissolved completely. Margaret's interest hadn't been genuine human concern. It had been the same curiosity her father exhibited, just dressed in more compassionate language. They were all the same. Every single one of them viewed him as something less than human, and that was a debt that needed settling. The spring of 1847 brought an unusual increase in tensions across South Carolina's plantation belt. Rumors spread of slave uprisings, of plots discovered and brutally suppressed, of paranoid planters sleeping with pistols beneath their pillows. The state legislature passed new laws restricting the movement of enslaved people, requiring written passes for any travel between plantations, increasing penalties for teaching literacy, and establishing harsh punishments for any black person who raised a hand against a white person, enslaved or free. Thaddeus Grantham followed these developments with obsessive attention, discussing them endlessly at dinner. He'd become convinced that education represented a danger to the social order, that literacy bred dangerous ideas in the enslaved population. It was therefore supremely ironic that he'd spent 3 years documenting an educated slave as a scientific curiosity without recognizing the contradiction in his own position. In April, Thaddeus made a decision that he announced over dinner. Samuel would be displayed at the Charleston Medical Society's annual meeting in May. The planter had spent weeks preparing a comprehensive presentation on albinism, complete with measurement sketches in that unsettling daguerreotype. Samuel would stand on stage while Thaddeus pointed out his unusual characteristics to an audience of physicians and natural philosophers. Samuel received this news with his customary blank expression, but inwardly something snapped into place. This was it, the final indignity, the culmination of 3 years of being treated as an object. He would be displayed like an exotic animal before an audience of men who would examine him with the same detached interest they'd give to a geological formation. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Samuel made his final calculations. The medical society meeting was scheduled for May 15th. He would act on May 10th, giving him 5 days before he was supposed to be in Charleston, 5 days before anyone would question his absence seriously. The first week of May brought perfect weather, warm days, cool nights, clear skies that promised easy travel once he made his escape. Samuel spent these days in careful observation, confirming the patterns he'd memorized. Thaddeus still read late in his study. Constance still took her lord at 9. The children still slept soundly on the 3rd floor, secure in the privilege of their whiteness and the protection they believed it afforded. On May 9th, Samuel approached Ezra in the stable one last time. The old man looked at him and nodded once, understanding passing between them without words. That evening, Dinah pressed a small package into Samuel's hands, dried meat and bread that would last several days. Jacob gave him a woolen cap, dark and nondescript, that would hide his distinctive hair if he needed to travel by day. "You make sure you get far," Jacob whispered. "Make sure this means something." "It will," Samuel promised. "I'll make sure of it." That night, May 9th, 1847, Samuel lay awake until he heard the household settle into sleep. At midnight, he rose and dressed in dark clothes he'd been gradually assembling. He took the knife from its hiding place, along with the forged freedom papers, the stolen money, and one other item he'd carefully preserved, the page from the plantation ledger, showing his purchase price of $750. He folded this paper carefully and placed it in his pocket. It would be the first thing he'd burn once he reached freedom, a symbolic gesture destroying the record of his having been bought and sold. But first, there was work to do. The house settled into the deep silence that comes after midnight. Samuel moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who'd mapped every creak and shadow. He climbed the servants' stair to the 3rd floor first, his soft leather shoes making no sound on the wooden steps. The children's rooms were arranged along the eastern hallway. Catherine's at the far end, Thomas is in the middle, Margaret's closest to the main staircase. Samuel stood outside Catherine's door for a long moment, the knife heavy in his hand. She was 8 years old, had shown him kindness, had brought him books, and treated him as human. For perhaps 30 seconds he wavered, caught between mercy and the cold logic that had brought him to this moment. Then he remembered Diner's daughter, sold south at age 7. He remembered Jacob's sister, worked to death in the rice fields before she turned 10. He remembered his own sister, whose name he'd almost forgotten, dead before she reached the age Catherine was now. The children of slave owners didn't get to be innocent. They were born into a system of brutality and would grow up to perpetuate it. Margaret had proven that in 10 years, little. Catherine would be disgusting her own slaves with the same casual cruelty her mother exhibited. What happened in those rooms on the 3rd floor of Grantham Plantation happened quickly and quietly. Samuel moved with surgical precision, the knife doing its work before any of the children fully woke. He'd learned anatomy from helping Dr. Whitfield during one of the physician's visits, had paid careful attention to where the blood vessels ran closest to the skin, had memorized the exact angle and depth needed to ensure death came quickly and silently. Catherine died still half asleep, never understanding what was happening. Thomas woke just enough to see the pale face above him and tried to cry out, but the sound never formed. Margaret's eyes opened fully, and in them Samuel saw recognition, then disbelief, then terror, then nothing. 3 lives ended in less than 5 minutes. Samuel cleaned the knife carefully on Margaret's bedsheet, then moved to the 2nd floor, where the master bedroom stood at the front of the house. Thaddeus and Constance slept on opposite sides of a large 4-poster bed, an arrangement that spoke of intimacy long since cooled into habit. Constance lay on her right side, facing away from her husband, her breath deep and even from the laudanum. Thaddeus slept on his back, snoring softly, one hand thrown across his chest. Samuel stood at the foot of the bed for a moment, looking at the man who'd purchased him, measured him, displayed him, treated him as a curiosity rather than a human being. All the rage he'd suppressed for 3 years rose up like a tide, threatening to overwhelm the cold calculation that had brought him this far. He moved to Constance's side first. She died without waking, the laudanum ensuring she felt nothing. Thaddeus was different. Samuel needed him to know, needed him to understand in that final moment what his 3 years of scientific curiosity had produced. Samuel placed his pale hand over Thaddeus's mouth, pressing down hard. The planter's eyes snapped open, confusion transforming to terror as he saw the pink-eyed face above him. He tried to struggle, tried to reach for the pistol he kept in the bedside table, but Samuel had already removed it hours earlier during his preparations. "The specimen wants you to know something," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible over Thaddeus's muffled attempts to scream. "Every measurement you took, every test you ran, every time you displayed me to your friends, I was studying you too, learning your patterns, memorizing your weaknesses. You thought I was the subject, but you were wrong. You were the experiment, and this is the conclusion." The knife did its work a final time. Thaddeus Grantham died staring into those unsettling pink eyes, finally understanding too late that he'd brought his family's destruction into his own home, paid $750 for it, and treated it as a curiosity rather than a threat. But Samuel wasn't finished. He had one more death to ensure, one that was perhaps the most important of all. He found old Ruth in the kitchen quarters, the deaf cook who'd been kind to him in her way, who'd never participated in the cruelty but had never challenged it either. She was 70 years old, too old to survive testimony at a trial, too old to run. Samuel stood over her bed for a long moment, the knife still in his hand, covered now in the blood of 5 people. Mercy stayed his hand this time, not because Ruth deserved it more than the others, but because he'd realized something. She would wake, find the bodies, sound the alarm, but by then he'd be gone, and her deafness would make her useless as a witness. She couldn't describe sounds, couldn't say she'd heard anything in the night, and her age would make her testimony suspect anyway. Instia. Samuel did something more calculated. He left Ruth alive, but took with him something that would tell a story. Thaddeus's gold pocket watch, Constance's jewelry, silver candlesticks from the dining room, cash from the study desk. He made it look like robbery, like violence born of greed rather than rage. The authorities would chase a thief, not a ghost. He moved through the house one final time, gathering supplies he'd need for his journey. Then he did something that revealed the depth of his planning. He went to the library and left behind a single item, the page from the plantation ledger showing his purchase price, placed carefully on Thaddeus's desk where it would be found immediately. Let them wonder. Let them question. Let them lie awake at night, knowing that the curiosity they displayed had been calculating vengeance while they measured his skull and tested his sensitivity to sunlight. Samuel left Grandantham Plantation at 3 a.m, disappearing into the darkness that was his ally in ways the Grantham family had never considered. His pale skin, which they'd viewed as a curiosity, became perfect camouflage in the moonlight. His light-sensitive eyes, which they tested and documented, could see in darkness that left others blind. He moved through the swamp like a ghost, heading for the abandoned cabin Ezra had shown him. Behind him, the plantation house stood silent in the darkness, holding its terrible secret for a few more hours before dawn would bring discovery and horror. Ruth discovered the bodies at dawn when Catherine failed to appear for breakfast. The cook's screams, though silent to her own ears, brought the overseer Virgil Cates running. What he found in that house would haunt Charleston society for years to come. 5 bodies, 7 if you counted the family dogs who'd been quietly poisoned the night before to prevent their barking. The Charleston Courier's first edition that afternoon carried a front-page story describing the Grandantham massacre, detailing the brutal deaths and noting the disappearance of Samuel, an albino slave of unusual appearance, approximately 22 years of age. The article mentioned stolen valuables and suggested robbery as a motive, though it carefully avoided mentioning the page from the plantation ledger left on Thaddeus's desk, a detail the authorities quickly decided to suppress. Within hours, search parties assembled. Bloodhounds were brought from neighboring plantations, their handlers confident that Samuel's unusual scent would make him easy to track, but the dogs lost the trail at the Ashley River just as Samuel had planned. Danina and Jacob questioned separately. Both reported seeing Samuel flee toward the water around midnight, well before the murders took place. Their alibis were shaky, but held under initial questioning. The investigation, led by Charleston Sheriff Marcus Pettin, quickly encountered problems that had nothing to do with finding Samuel, and everything to do with what his capture might reveal. Dr. Whitfield, questioned about his interactions with the slave, reluctantly admitted that he'd engaged in lengthy conversations with Samuel and found him remarkably intelligent and articulate, perhaps dangerously so. This created an immediate problem for the planter class. If Samuel was intelligent enough to plan and execute such murders, it challenged the fundamental justification for slavery that black people were intellectually inferior and needed white guidance. If he was capable of such calculated revenge, it suggested that enslaved people everywhere might be harboring similar thoughts, just waiting for opportunity. A meeting convened at the Charleston Hotel 3 days after the murders brought together 15 of the wealthiest planters in the region. The discus. Sion, recorded in fragmentary notes by a Clare who later destroyed most of his minutes, reveals the true nature of their concerns. The question isn't whether we'll catch him, one planter argued. The question is what we do if we catch him alive. A public trial would be devastating. Every newspaper from Boston to New Orleans would cover it. Every abolitionist would use it as ammunition against our way of life. Then we ensure there's no trial, Sheriff Pettin replied. If Samuel is found, he'll be shot while resisting arrest. Simple as that. But finding Samuel proved far more difficult than anyone anticipated. The immediate search of the surrounding swamps revealed nothing. Patrols on the roads to Charleston found no trace of anyone matching his distinctive appearance. It was as if he'd simply vanished. What the searchers didn't know was that Samuel had never left the immediate area. The abandoned cabin in the swamp where Ezra had directed him sat on a piece of land so tangled with vegetation and treacherous footing that even the bloodhounds avoided it. Samuel spent the first week there subsisting on the food Diner had provided and water from a nearby creek, waiting for the initial fury of the search to exhaust itself. During those days alone in the swamp, Samuel experienced something unexpected. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of hollow victory that tasted like ash. He'd achieved what he'd planned for 3 years, had taken revenge on the family that treated him as a curiosity rather than a human being. But the price of that revenge was that he could never be fully human again. He'd become the monster they'd always feared black people might be. Yet when he thought of Catherine's face, of Margaret's terror, of Thaddeus's final understanding, he found he couldn't regret it. They'd bought and sold human beings, broken families, destroyed lives with the casual indifference of Peep. Who'd never once questioned their right to own other people. His victims had been guilty by birth, by participation, by their willful blindness to the suffering their prosperity required. After a week, Samuel began moving only at night, heading slowly northeast. His plan was to reach Virginia, then Pennsylvania, then eventually Canada, where the Fugitive Slave Act couldn't touch him, but he needed money, supplies, and papers that would hold up under scrutiny. This was when the thefts began. The Untold plantation, 20 miles north of Charleston, was hit first. On May 20th, the family woke to find their safe opened, $200 missing, along with food supplies and a traveling coat that belonged to Edmund Rutledge himself. The only clue was a single pale handprint on the windowsill, small enough to overlook, obvious enough to be intentional. 3 days later, the Garrison family in Orangeburg reported a similar theft. Money, papers, food, all taken while they slept. The house's lockbox had been opened with surgical precision, requiring either great skill or careful observation of where the key was hidden. A single white hair found on the study desk confirmed what everyone suspected, but no one wanted to acknowledge. Samuel was still operating in South Carolina, and he was moving with confidence that suggested extensive planning. The pattern continued through June. 6 more robberies, each executed with the same precision, each leaving just enough evidence to confirm Samuel's involvement without providing useful tracking information. The enslaved communities whispered about him with a mixture of fear and admiration. He'd become a ghost story, a phantom who moved through the night taking revenge on the planter class. But it was the note left at the Havsham plantation in Georgetown that transformed the investigation into something more urgent. On June 28th, the family woke to find the Ayers safe empty and a carefully written message on expensive paper that had been stolen from Mr. Havsham's own desk. "You collected me like a specimen. You displayed me like a trophy. You measured me like an animal. Did you think I wasn't measuring you in return? Did you think I wasn't learning your patterns, your weaknesses, your vulnerabilities? Every plantation house is the same. Confident in its walls, secure in its power, blind to the threat you've created by treating human beings as property. Sleep well, gentlemen. Your curiosity has educated something you can't control." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched samples of Samuel's writing from Thaddeus Grantham's study. More importantly, it was written in perfect English with sophisticated vocabulary and complex sentence structure, proof that undermined every argument about racial inferiority that justified the entire system of slavery. The Charleston Mercury ran a carefully edited version of the note, removing the more inflammatory passages, but the damage was done. Copists made duplicates and circulated them among the planter class. Abolitionist newspapers in the North somehow obtained the full text and published it alongside editorials condemning the institution of slavery. Samuel's revenge had expanded beyond the Grand Anthem family to threaten the entire social order of the South. Sheriff Pettin doubled the reward to $5,000, an enormous sum that attracted bounty hunters from 3 states. Professional slave catchers, some of whom had reputations as brutal as their profession required, converged on South Carolina. But Samuel remained one step ahead, his unusual appearance somehow failing to mark him despite dozens of searchers looking specifically for a pale-skinned black man with pink eyes. The secret to his continued evasion lay partly in the enslaved community's protection, despite, or perhaps because, of his terrible actions. Samuel had become a symbol of resistance. Enslaved people who had information about his movements simply claimed to have seen nothing, heard nothing, known nothing. The code of silence that protected runaway slaves extended to protect their ghost, but Samuel had also planned more carefully than anyone realized. During his 3 years at Grand Anthem Plantation, he'd sewn ash into dark clothing that covered his pale skin, had acquired tinted glasses that hid his pink eyes, had practiced moving with the stooped gait of an old man to disguise his height and grace. When necessary, he could pass as an elderly white man. His unusual coloring explained away his age and sun damage rather than albinism. In July, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A traveling photographer named Henry Dors arrived in Charleston with news that he'd encountered Samuel in Columbia, nearly 100 meters inland, and had actually spoken with him. Dors had been setting up his Girapia equipment when a pale man with tinted spectacles approached, offering to pay $5 for a portrait. An unusual request from someone who should have been avoiding documentation. He knew exactly what he was doing. Dors told Sheriff Pettin he posed with perfect stillness, knew how long the exposure required, even suggested angles that would capture his features most clearly. When I asked why he wanted the portrait, he said, "So there's a record of what I really looked like, not what they turned me into." Then he paid in cash and disappeared before I could process what he meant. The resulting daguerreotype showed Samuel in profile, his pale face captured in perfect detail, his expression neutral, but his pink eyes containing what looked almost like amusement. Copies were made and distributed to every sheriff's office and slave patrol in the South, but the gesture seemed almost like mockery. Samuel had voluntarily created the very documentation the authorities desperately wanted, then vanished again. August brought an escalation that changed the nature of the pursuit. The Williams plantation in Colleton County was attacked on August 12th, but this time the theft was accompanied by something more. The plantation's records, ledgers documenting every enslaved person's purchase price, age, value, and sale, were found burning in the fireplace. The smoke damage was minimal, but the symbolic message was clear. Samuel wasn't just stealing money, he was destroying the documentation of human ownership itself. 3 days later, the Patterson plantation suffered the same fate. Records burned, money stolen, and this time, a locked room was opened to reveal letters documenting the sale of a young girl to a brothel in New Orleans. Correspondence the Patterson family had wanted kept private. These letters were left prominently displayed on the dining room table, ready to be found by the morning's visitors. The pattern revealed Samuel's true intention. He wasn't just seeking freedom, he was waging a careful campaign to expose the secrets the planter class kept even from each other. He was using his unusual ability to move unseen to document their private cruelties, to reveal the transactions and correspondence they hid from public view. By September, paranoia gripped the South Carolina plantation belt. Families began sleeping in locked rooms, installing bars on windows, hiring armed guards to patrol at night. But these precautions seemed only to challenge Samuel further. The more security they added, the more boldly he operated, as if daring them to catch him. On September 10, 1847, exactly 1 day before Samuel's planned final exit from South Carolina, he made his most audacious move. He returned to Grantham Plantation. The estate had been purchased by a cousin of Thaddeus's, a man named Charles Grantham, who'd arrived from Virginia with his own family. Charles had gotten the property at a reduced price because of its dark history, and he'd brought with him 30 enslaved people from his previous holdings, intending to restore the plantation's productivity. But Charles Grantham had also brought something that Samuel needed: detailed maps of the Underground Railroad routes through Virginia, documents he kept locked in Thaddeus's former study because he secretly sympathized with abolition while publicly maintaining the appearance of a slaveholder. The contradiction didn't excuse him, but it made him a target Samuel could exploit. The break-in occurred during a rainstorm that masked any noise. Samuel entered through the same window he'd used for his preparation months earlier, moved through the house with the confidence of someone who'd once lived there, and spent 20 minutes in the study photographing documents with a small Juray camera he'd stolen weeks earlier. He left with maps, names of safe houses, coded letters, everything he needed to ensure his successful escape to Canada. But he also left something behind: a photograph. The same portrait Henry Dors had taken, placed carefully on the desk where Thaddeus Grantham's body had been found 4 months earlier. On the back, Samuel had written a final message: "Science teaches that every action has consequences. You measured me, documented me, displayed me as if I were a specimen rather than a soul. These are the consequences. Sleep well in your plantation houses. Remember that the curiosity you owned once walked your halls, knew your secrets, and chose his moment. I was never your specimen. You were mine." When Charles Grantham found the photograph the next morning, he immediately contacted the authorities. But Samuel was already gone, moving with the confidence of someone who'd planned every detail of his escape. The maps he'd stolen showed him safe routes. The money he'd accumulated funded his journey, and the forged freedom papers he'd perfected over 3 years would allow him to travel openly once he crossed into Pennsylvania. The last confirmed sighting of Samuel came on September 15, 1847, in Richmond, Virginia. A hotel clerk reported serving a pale gentleman with tinted spectacles who paid cash, spoke with refined vocabulary, and left after one night heading north. The description matched, but by the time authorities investigated, Samuel had vanished into the complex network of the Underground Railroad. Over the following weeks, reports came from Maryland, then Pennsylvania, then New York, each one less reliable than the last, each one describing someone who might have been Samuel, or might have been any pale person in a region where unusual appearances were less noteworthy than in the insular South. The final unconfirmed report came from a conductor on the Underground Railroad named Thomas Garrett, who later claimed in his private journal that he helped a man matching Samuel's description reach Ontario in October of 1847. Garrett noted that the man traveled with maps stolen from Virginia, spoke with the careful diction of someone educated by his oppressors, and carried with him a plantation ledger page that he burned in a stove the moment he crossed into Canada, watching the paper turn to ash with an expression Garrett described as not triumph, but something quieter, the face of a man who'd paid a price he'd been willing to pay and was now ready to discover what came after vengeance. The official investigation into the Grandanthem massacre continued sporadically for another 2 years, growing less vigorous as the trail grew colder, and the authorities became more interested in containment than capture. The final report, filed in 1849, declared that Samuel had most likely perished while attempting to cross into Pennsylvania, his distinctive appearance making survival among white populations impossible. This conclusion satisfied no one but allowed the case to be officially closed. What the official report failed to mention were the decisions made behind closed doors by Charleston's most powerful citizens. A second meeting at the Charleston Hotel in November of 1847, attended by planters, judges, and newspaper editors, resulted in an agreement that Samuel's story would be deliberately obscured. The Charleston Courier published a brief notice that the suspected perpetrator had drowned in the Ashley River, his body recovered and buried in an unmarked grave, a complete fabrication designed to end public discussion. The reasoning was simple but chilling. Samuel's successful escape and his methodical campaign of revenge challenged every assumption the institution of slavery required. If an enslaved person could plan with such precision, execute with such calculation, and evade capture while exposing the secrets of multiple plantation families, what did that suggest about the capabilities of the millions still held in bondage? Better to declare him dead and pretend the threat had been neutralized than to acknowledge the truth, that he'd outwitted the entire apparatus of Southern law and custom. For the enslaved community of South Carolina, Samuel's story took on a different kind of life, whispered in quarters at night, shared in careful code during church services. His tale transformed from horror story into something else, a legend of resistance that carried both warning and promise. The warning, the price of vengeance is high. The promise, that price can be paid if you're willing to calculate it carefully. But some people closer to the events couldn't escape the truth so easily. Edmund Ruddled, Thaddeus Grantham's factor, who'd negotiated Samuel's purchase, sold his interest in the slave trade within 6 months of the massacre. He told business associates that the market had changed, but those who knew him well noted that he'd stop sleeping through the night, would wake suddenly, claiming to see pale faces at his window, pink eyes watching from the darkness. Dr. Whitfield, the Charleston physician who'd examined Samuel and discussed whether albinism affected intelligence, became an unlikely advocate for abolition, though he framed his arguments carefully in medical and moral terms rather than political ones. In his personal journal discovered after his death in 1872, he wrote, "I have spent my life studying the human body, convinced I understood its varieties and limitations. Then I met a young man whose appearance I found fascinating, whose mind I underestimated, and whose capacity for strategic thinking exceeded mine. I wonder now what other assumptions I've made about people based on their appearance, what other intelligences I've failed to recognize because they came in forms I'd been taught to view as inferior." Charles Grantham, who'd purchased the plantation and lost the Underground Railroad documents, abandoned the estate within a year. He freed his 30 enslaved people, moved to Philadelphia, and devoted the rest of his life to abolitionist work, a dramatic conversion that local society attributed to guilt over his cousin's murder, but that Charles himself described differently. "I saw what treating people as property produced," he told a reporter in 1855. "I saw the ledgers documenting human sales as if they were livestock transactions. I saw the consequences of viewing intelligence as a curiosity rather than a challenge to my assumptions, and I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life sleeping in a locked room, wondering if tonight would be the night my own curiosities came for me." The Grandanthem plantation itself was eventually sold to a farming cooperative in 1852 and broken into smaller parcels. The main house stood empty for several years, local reputation claiming it was haunted by the ghosts of the family murdered there. Eventually it was torn down, the materials salvaged for other construction, and by 1860 nothing remained but the foundation stones and the live oak trees that had witnessed everything. But physical places are not the only repositories of memory. In the decades following 1847, stories about Samuel spread through the Underground Railroad network, through freed communities in the North, through the careful oral histories that enslaved people maintained when written records were forbidden to them. The details varied in the telling. Sometimes Samuel reached Canada and lived to old age. Sometimes he died crossing into Pennsylvania. Sometimes he was never real at all, but merely a symbol of what resistance might look like if pushed to its ultimate conclusion. What's consistent across these stories is the image they preserve. A man with pale skin and pink eyes who was purchased as a curiosity, studied as a specimen, displayed as an oddity, and who responded by turning the plantation house that held him into a mirror that reflected back its own brutality. Whether he lived or died after escaping South Carolina matters less than what his story represented. Proof that enslaved people were not the passive victims their owners wanted to believe, but human beings calculating, planning, waiting for their moment. In 1883, a journalist named Rebecca Townsend traveled to South Carolina researching a book about antebellum plantation life. During her investigation, she interviewed dozens of formerly enslaved people, now elderly, who remembered the 1840s. Several mentioned Samuel's story, though none claimed to have known him personally. One woman, identified in Townsend's notes only as Dina C., provided an account that stands as the closest thing to a direct testimony about the events. There was a man, pale as moonlight, who came to the plantation where I worked. The master brought him to study, treated him like something in a museum. We all knew it would end badly. You can't treat a person like an object and expect them to forget they're human. When it happened, when they found the family dead, some people said it was evil. But I thought about my daughter, sold south when she was 7. I thought about Jacob's back, torn open because he learned to read. I thought about Ruth's son, worked to death in the rice fields before he turned 20. And I wondered why we called one kind of violence evil, but accepted the other kind as normal. That pale man, he just balanced the scales. He made the choice most of us couldn't make because we had families to protect, communities that needed us. He had nothing to lose, so he took what was owed. I don't know if he lived or died after he left, but I know he was free when he left, which is more than most of us could ever say. Townsend's book was never published. She spent 3 years researching and writing, but when she tried to find a publisher, every press she approached refused. The manuscript was too controversial, too sympathetic to the enslaved perspective, too willing to present Samuel as something other than a simple villain. The manuscript itself was lost in a fire at Townsend's Boston home in 1887, and with it went the most comprehensive account of Samuel's story that anyone had attempted. By 1900, the events at Grantham Plantation had faded into obscurity, remembered by historians only as a footnote in discussions of slave rebellions and mentioned in passing in books about antebellum South Carolina. The particular details, the albinism, the scientific study, the methodical revenge were lost to broader narratives that couldn't accommodate their complexity. But in the black communities of South Carolina, Georgia, and points north, Samuel's story persisted in a different form. He became part of the oral tradition that preserved memories slavery's defenders wanted erased. Parents told their children about the pale man who'd been studied like an animal and who'd responded by studying his captors in return. The story carried lessons about patience, about calculation, about the necessity of understanding your enemy before you move against them. And it carried a warning for anyone who might find themselves with power over another human being. Curiosity is not neutral. When you treat someone as an object of study rather than a person deserving respect, you create something you cannot control. You teach them to observe you while you think you're observing them. You provide them time to learn your vulnerabilities while you're documenting their peculiarities. You transform them from victim into strategist, from specimen into threat. The Grandanthem family massacre of 1847 remains officially unsolved in the Charleston County records. The file preserved in the county archives contains the original investigation notes, the edited newspaper accounts, the false report of Samuel's drowning. What it doesn't contain is the truth that an enslaved man purchased for $750 as a living curiosity had methodically destroyed the family that owned him, then escaped into freedom while evading the entire law enforcement apparatus of the antebellum South. Whether Samuel actually reached Canada, whether he lived to see slavery's eventual abolition, whether he ever felt at peace with what he'd done, these questions have no answers in the historical record. Perhaps he died crossing into Pennsylvania, as the official report claimed. Perhaps he lived to old age in Ontario, keeping his story to himself while building a new life far from the plantation that had treated him as a specimen. Perhaps he's buried in an unmarked grave somewhere along the Underground Railroad. One more casualty of the fight for freedom whose name was never recorded. But in another sense, it doesn't matter what happened to Samuel after he left South Carolina. His story had already done its work. It had exposed the fundamental contradiction in the slave system. The people held as property were calculating, planning, remembering every cruelty, and measuring every opportunity. It had revealed that treating human beings as objects of scientific curiosity was not neutral scholarship, but violence that would eventually demand accounting. And it had left a question that plantation owners across the South couldn't quite escape. When you sleep in your locked rooms, secure in your power and convinced of your superiority, how do you know that someone isn't watching? How do you know that the person you've reduced to a curiosity, a specimen, an object of study, isn't learning you in return? How do you know that tonight won't be the night when 3 years of careful observation yields its calculated reward? These questions haunted the dreams of more than one planter in the years following 1847. They should have haunted more, because Samuel's greatest lesson was this: you cannot treat people as less than human without creating the conditions for your own destruction. You cannot build a society on the foundation of viewing others as property without eventually meeting someone who's learned to use your assumptions against you. And when that meeting comes, all your locked doors and armed guards and desperate searches will mean nothing, because the threat isn't outside your walls. It never was. The threat is in every ledger documenting human sales, every scientific study measuring skull dimensions, every casual conversation discussing human beings as if they were livestock or curiosities. The threat is in the system itself, and no amount of security can protect you from the consequences of what you've created. The story of the Grand Anthem Massacre is the story of those consequences playing out in one household with one man over 3 years of careful, patient, methodical planning. It's a story that was deliberately suppressed because its truth would have meant acknowledging that enslaved people everywhere were capable of the same calculation, the same patience, the same willingness to wait for their moment. So they declared Samuel dead, filed the case away, and tried to forget. But the enslaved community remembered, and they passed the story down through generations, keeping alive the truth that power creates its own opposition, that curiosity can become weapon, and that the curiosity purchased for $750 had proven worth far more than the Grantham family ever imagined, just not in the way they'd expected. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Samuel truly escaped to freedom, or did he die in the attempt? Leave your comment below with your theories. If this tale of calculated revenge and hidden history chilled you, subscribe to our channel for more forgotten stories from America's dark past. Hit that notification bell to never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex truths that official histories try to bury. The past is never as simple as we're taught, and some stories demand to be remembered, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another chapter of history that time tried to erase.